If they hear me talking out loud to myself, they'll think I'm a crazy old man. I'm not crazy.
The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I didn't expect this book. I had never heard of it before, but it was probably the most pleasant experience I've ever had reading a book. And I want to share that joy that I had with you. Even if it's not your cup of tea, maybe you'll see something there that you didn't before. It's what books are for, after all. Now, a lot of people didn't feel the same way I did about The Old Man and the Sea. Apparently, middle school and high school English teachers force their students to read it. This results in it having a much lower score on Goodreads than it deserves. If you're in middle school, you don't care about Old Men or the sea or either of those things put together. It's kind of hard to like something when it's being shoved down your throat. Unless it's cake. But for me, at the time that I was reading this book, I was reading books like Moby Dick and a few others about the ocean. I was really into ocean imagery and the aesthetic of being a fisherman and a sailor and living connected to nature. And I even connected with the old man. And those are two things that kids in middle school are not going to understand or relate to in any way. Let kids read like Hunger Games or something. That's about kids overthrowing a tyrannical hierarchy. That's interesting. So I understand the reviews, except this one. I cannot understand how you can hate Metamorphosis. That's the craziest book ever and it's super funny. Read that book. Goodreads, why? But to me, I would read a bit of this book every night before I went to bed, and it made me so happy just to take a journey onto the ocean with old Santiago. It's much better than thinking about whatever stressful thing that I had to worry about for the next day or what was happening in the world. The story is about a fisherman that's gone 84 days without catching anything. And he goes the 85th day out into the ocean to catch a big fish. And pretty much all that information is in the first line of the book. And the whole thing stays that matter of fact. It just says it how it is. After reading a lot of genres in fiction and non-fiction and academic writing, it's so refreshing just to hear a writer say exactly what he wants to say and describe the scene just how it is without any preachiness or anything tacked onto it. Now, because of this book, I think a lot of people think Hemingway writes in short, ugly sentences, and that's really not true. There's a lot of beautiful descriptions and feelings brought out by the book, very beautifully but concisely. Like, look at this. The old man was thin and gaunt, with deep wrinkles in the back of his neck. The brown blotches of the benevolent skin cancer the sun brings from its reflection on the tropic sea were on his cheeks. That's cool. That's a nice sentence. There's some description there. You definitely get a picture of who this guy is. It's not just like, there's an old man. To me, the writing style gave it a very present feel. I felt very much all the emotions the man had and why he was feeling them. And I didn't sense all those things because I was told by the writer about them. I wasn't told the old man fantasizes about the new things of the world and wanted to be a part of them, even though he knew he was too old to get involved. No. Instead, the book tells us that the old man listens to baseball on the radio and frequently thinks about baseball. And so you can tell this old man has kind of a desire to see these new things come to life and see the new ways the world is turning. And he longs to be a part of that, but also he's an old man, so he just keeps fishing. This type of creating layers of meaning is present in every work of art through the assumptions we bring into reading the work, or any insinuations or subtext or symbolism that's present. We view all media through this lens of finding meaning, and a good writer will hide that meaning behind something. It won't just come out and have the narrator say, oh, the protagonist studies his school and passes his test because he learned that hard work pays off. No. Obviously, that would make a very interesting story. You gotta hide the meaning under something, and so a good writer would just show the protagonist is studying, and then struggling on the test, like Johnny works really hard on the test. He struggles. His brow sweats. That's what he said. Johnny's brow sweats with the sweat of his brow, and then show his relief after when he passes the test. That's what a good writer would do. He'd show you what's happening on the surface, and you'd go, okay, this is the meaning, and you'd see the story unfolding underneath that. A lot of people say this is kind of like showing versus telling, basically. That kind of applies here. But what Hemingway was trying to accomplish is what he basically called his iceberg theory, which was basically think a whole bunch, have all this deep meaning, but only just show what's on the surface, what's directly happening in the scene, because that's what you're writing to people is you're describing events, you're having the plot unfold, and then you trust your reader to figure out what's happening underneath. So all that deep stuff under the surface is still there. It's not just empty, but it makes the surface more stable. And if you dig down into the iceberg, you can see what's down there. And I think there's a lot of themes in the book, for example, and I think they're really cool, but I don't think looking at the themes is all that interesting or useful, especially with a book like this. But there's a lot of them. It talks about old age and loneliness and the passing of generations and time and death and wanting to provide for yourself and do something meaningful and prove people wrong and make your own luck and new and old things and the parallel between that, or juxtaposition, I don't know, technological and social growth, class struggles, father-son relationships. There's a lot of different themes in the way that life has a lot of different themes. They don't seem to just be there to exhibit whatever point the writer was trying to say. They're not there to accomplish a goal. And I can see sometimes maybe writers being tempted to doing that. But they're there because Hemingway is trying to tell a genuine story, simply and honestly. And all of those things are a part of life, and so they're part of the story that he tells. And I don't think being vague necessarily makes you tell a more honest story, just not having descriptions. But maybe being concise helps a little bit. If you spend less time preaching and more spend just delivering what the story is, what actually matters, without any tacked on, and by the way, the lions represent time, or whatever. The writer just lets the story sit with the reader, and we can just breathe it in and go, that's pretty good. We're able to be at home with the story and enjoy it for what it is, instead of having to have all this preachiness like Ayn Rand, hey, this is what it means, you should think this is right. But still, the story has suspense and conflict and a well-defined plot with twists and characterization. It's just simple. I think a lot of people miss all of that being there, and they miss kind of the drama that happens in the story, because The Old Man and the Sea is not about what most books are about. Most books tend to be about a hero, and he generally saves the world, or like at least a good portion of the world. But this book is about an old man's life. There's no Michael Bay explosions. There's no underdog overthrowing the tyrannical wizard government. It's just an old guy. There's certainly nothing wrong with having a large, epic scope, but as I learn more and more in life, I'm able to enjoy things at a small scope. Growing flowers in the windowsill in my kitchen brings me a lot more joy than a lot of the larger scope things that I used to tend to focus on, that were never really real, that I was never really a part of. And that is the feeling that I really got from the book. Mindfulness of yourself and your surroundings, and just simple living, I guess. When I read this book, I think I might enjoy the salt water on my lips and relish in the taste of that flying fish that I'm rationing out for myself, and feel the relief as I sense the big fish slowing down the other end of my line. All these things are everyday things for Santiago, not necessarily for me. So my ability to understand and enjoy his life was expanded when I read this book. But all this was without fluff. It was just a story about someone very similar and very different from me. That's all you really need in a book, and it's what I really enjoyed about The Old Man and the Sea in particular. Just thinking from the comfort of my bed what it would be like to be out there, getting dragged out to sea by a fish. And I think experiencing someone else's life is a really big thing. I think it's the foundation of learning to be a more empathetic person. Whenever my mom met someone really open-minded and humble, she'd always say something like, they must be well-traveled. And that was because she could tell pretty much that if somebody's been across the world, because they would start to grow more mindful of other people's cultures and meet a whole bunch of different people and see kind of the common threads and see where they have a lot to learn and grow. And it really helps you stop being so close-minded and bigoted and open up to new ideas and the fact that the world doesn't revolve around you. And you start to learn how much greatness is actually out there in other people, and you can start to appreciate that. And I think this would actually be a really effective solution to being bigoted. Putting yourself in the shoes of others, or the rowboat of others, I think that's really the foundation of empathy. And empathy is the opposite of being closed-minded and bigoted and hating people for superficial reasons, or hating people in general. I can understand people that read this book and just simply weren't interested in the life of Santiago, an old Cuban fisherman in 1950. That's okay. But the more you travel outside yourself and the more people you meet, the more you come to understand people that are not you, the more that you become interested in people that are different from you. And I think Hemingway does this really well. I mentioned that I read For Whom the Bell Tolls, and I really felt like I understood the mindset of people that are on the front lines of war in a way that I didn't expect I could. It's not that I think I have the perspectives of someone who's been on the front lines, but I feel like I've met someone who's been on the front lines. What's that quote? A reader lives 1,000 lives, something like that. But The Old Man and the Sea did that for me, for elderly people, for people that are down on their luck, for people that are inescapable poverty. That's a big, relevant issue, and building understanding of these situations will help me in my interactions with other people and my interactions in the world to be more empathetic and make decisions in the future that's more understanding of other people and more humble. And I think that's a good thing. I felt like I got an image into Santiago's life. The book gives you this feeling of like the world is very big in comparison to the old man. The sea is infinite, and he has no control on whether he catches a fish now or if he goes 85 days and he happens to be unlucky and he doesn't even catch a fish. But the same ocean that gives him the 84 days of bad luck, or as he calls it, Saleo, it's the same ocean that gives him the biggest fish he's caught. I read this during the pandemic, and it really made me think what horrified people the most is the fact that we didn't have control over it. Now in the book, Santiago didn't get a fish for a whole long time, and his fishing trip doesn't go as planned. But he doesn't take it personally. He considers the sea and the fish and even the sharks in the water his brothers. And he actually often expresses in the book that it's a shame that the fish has to die. And I feel like as technology progresses, we kind of lose that sense of our connection to the world. And maybe it's always been this way, but I think we overestimate our ability to control our own lives and control the planet. And so when things like this global health crisis has come out, people are freaking out because we have this idea that we should be in control. But maybe we should just be in control of ourselves, and we should be in control of how we're reacting, because we're more like a fisherman in the boat. All he can do is go out to sea for 84 days or 85 days and cast out my line. And the same sea that will give us bad luck gives us the fish and gives us the sharks. And the sea isn't evil. Santiago never hates the ocean for not giving him fish. It's just water. And the world isn't just evil. And it's not just pain. It's just difficult. It's just a world. It's just full of things. And it's like the ocean. It's chaotic. And at the end of the day, even as an old man, it's worth a 3-day trip out just to even fail at catching a fish. It's worth the trip. That's why I think The Old Man and the Sea is not actually a tragedy as a lot of people consider it. Even if an old man doesn't catch the fish, not saying he does or doesn't, no spoilers, he defeats the sea. He defeated his lack of luck, the card that's dealt to him. He rises above that. And all the fishermen are proud of him when he gets back, and he keeps living the life that he was living. It struck me really how genuine and valuable Santiago's life was when he was out on the boat and he rationed his food and water, and he was very careful to make sure he'd get home safe. It was just of the highest importance to him just to live. And I think without all the things that distract us from life, just us living mindful of our situation, of our feelings, of everything around us and everything that living means and brings with it. We just want to live more than anything. Living itself is actually great. And I don't think the fisherman's survival was the main point of the whole excursion and the book. I think it was maybe part of it, just like it's part of everything. But there's a quote actually that exhibits a slightly more complex relationship with the fish than just it's his sustenance. It says, "You did not kill the fish only to keep alive and to sell for food," he thought. "You killed them for pride and because you're a fisherman. You loved him when he was alive, and you loved him after. If you love him, is it not a sin to kill him, or is it more?" Now, pride is definitely a part of it. Santiago's drive to accomplish something and his identity as a fisherman, not just trying to survive. Spark Notes was like, this book is about this man's quest for survival. It's really about so much more. It's about his entire life, self-perception and his identity and his interaction with the world and his honor, so to speak, like the feeling of nobility that he has. That's a big thing. But at the same time, that's kind of strange is he feels really sorry for the fish. And maybe this is because he killed the fish for pride's sake. But it's interesting how an author people consider to be the most macho writer is talking about feeling sorry for the animal he kills. I bet you Hemingway would have cried if he saw Bambi. Now, having just read one of Hemingway's other books, For Whom the Bell Tolls, shows a lot from the perspective of a soldier, and I can't help but see a similar sentiment echoed in that book towards killing in war as killing the fish. And they literally describe it as the same. They say killing in war is a sin. They talk about it a lot. And I don't think Hemingway was trying to allude to that directly, but maybe that's just his perspective on killing in general. Now, the soldiers in For Whom the Bell Tolls talk about people who kill in war and then the people that love to kill. And basically they make a distinction between those things. They say something like people who love to kill are monsters or something. And that sounds a lot like kind of the comparison of loving the fish and still killing him, and whether that's more of a sin or not. It's an interesting parallel. Now, I didn't see the last half of the book coming, but I was pleasantly surprised by the last few pages. It left me feeling really at peace with the story, and I felt like the protagonist, the old man, had really come to peace with how it ended. Unlike a lot of the stories where writers will create these ambiguous endings or leave it on a sour note just to have a memorable effect, they go and they get coffee, the old man and the boy, and the fishermen are all surprised with what they see. The old man and the boy decide they just are gonna fish together in the future, and they're kind of resolved, and he sees the lions on the beach. That feels to me just that the old man's come to peace with his life, and with the end of his life, so to speak, and with all of his successes and his failures, he's content with how the world is and where he is in the world, lucky or not. And I don't see that as a tragedy at all. I think the old man won. He conquered the fish, and as a result, he got the best one that got away story ever. The thing is, when people stereotypically tell that story, they're not sad stories, they're bragging stories. This is a bragging book, it's not a sad book. Now, what's really interesting to note is that when Hemingway was writing this, he was dealing with the fact that he was getting older and he had spent a long time without writing a bestseller. And the critics were all saying that he was washed up, that he was done as a writer. And so he wrote this to say, not only is he not done as a writer, but he's yet to put out his best work. He's not only not done fishing, he's yet to catch the biggest fish he's ever caught. Now, I don't think he was writing this as an autobiography. I just think his situation framed his thoughts and his feelings when he wrote this book. As the detective novelist P.D. James said, all fiction is largely autobiographical, and all biography is, of course, fiction. I didn't find this story just to have an enjoyable journey, satisfying ending, deep, interesting characters, place, and plot, but I also felt like you could derive a lot of meaning from it. That's why I'm pretty sure a bunch of English teachers sacrificed this book on the altar of middle school summer reading lists. You can draw metaphors and symbols from this book galore, because it's almost like a fable. For example, you could see the young man and the old man's relationship as representing the younger generation accepting all the positives and negatives of the older generation, all the faults and responsibilities that come with the generation before it. That's kind of the archetypal story of the boy rescuing his father from the underworld, just like Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, or Pinocchio. A lot of people say that the fish symbolizes nature, boat symbolizes time, and the old man symbolizes time. I don't know, everything symbolizes time. Hemingway heard all these critics trying to come up with these metaphors and symbolism, and he basically came out and said, that's all crap. And the man is just a man, and the fish is just a fish. And that led me to really think that we misunderstand metaphors. I think a lot of times we put the metaphors in front of the story instead of the story in front of the metaphor. For example, I don't think the marlin was written to symbolize life's worthy struggle or nature itself. I don't think that's the true meaning of the work. I think the fish is just a fish, but you can actually learn through stories of everyday things. You don't have to make some complicated lesson out of them. In other words, it's not a story about the past struggling against time to defeat nature. It's a story about a man fishing a fish. And I think when teachers and literary critics try to apply a bunch of fluff onto a story with simple beauty, it eats away at people's enjoyment. It's not that I think these metaphors don't work. I think they're all really good ideas. It's just that everything doesn't need to be a symbol to actually matter. A story doesn't have to have all these symbols to matter. It just has to be a meaningful story. I think honest stories about the world can explain honest truths about the world in a way that coming up with extensive allegories to fit your own ideas cannot do. So probably the most useful way of reading the story is of a man that just catches a fish. And maybe that story has echoes of truth that you can apply to your life, or you can see the world in a different way because of that, or you can just learn from stepping in this guy's shoes. Here's an example. You can say, look at my life. I have this desire to do something great, just like the man. And I have an ability, just like the man does. And I know what it feels like to go 84 days without a fish. I know what that feeling is. That feeling of being unlucky and nothing I can do can produce fruit or go right. I know what that feels like. And so I'm gonna go out into the Gulf on the 85th day and catch the biggest fish that I can, no matter how many days it drags me out to sea. That's a really cool application of the story. That's like a really cool personal application, and it's maybe true, and maybe it's an honest way of doing that, but that doesn't mean that Hemingway wrote the fish to be a symbol of our personal desires and the old man to symbolize you and me. just because something is true doesn't mean that's what the writer intended, or just because you can see it in that way, or if the story works in that regard, doesn't mean that that's the fundamental metaphor. So in other words, you can't extrapolate story from a metaphor, but you can extrapolate metaphors from a story, which makes the story the fundamental essence and not the metaphor and not the symbols. So I guess kind of my point is this book really exemplifies the fact that stories are pre-existent, not the metaphor or the point. It's just the story and life itself. And the point of telling a story is telling a story. It's not to preach at somebody. And I think the more you meet people and the more you read about people, the more you start to become comfortable with not having an agenda and not trying to get something from people, and just you start appreciating people and events and things in your life for what they are and not what they can do for you. You start appreciating the things that are difficult, the feeling of the line on your hands after 3 days of holding that fish. You start to go, that pain in my hands is the feeling of catching a fish. You start to appreciate things. You start to appreciate your life and living itself. No fluff, just real life, and that's a good thing. Even with all the bad parts, life is good. Even if it destroys you, even if you get nothing from it, you can give yourself to the world. You can give yourself to everyone you know and everyone you meet, just like the biblical figure of Christ. And that's what I got from the end of the book. The old man said it best, I think. Man is not made for defeat, he said. A man can be destroyed, but not defeated. And that's why I think The Old Man and the Sea is not a tragedy. It's a big look into a small life. I think if you read it, you'll understand a little more about what Santiago's life was like, and maybe you'll understand a little bit more about yourself because of that. And that's why I think you should read The Old Man and the Sea.